First question for you two is just real simple, real simple. Start this off. Basic impression of the film. What did you think of anything? Any particular comments you have on it? Just kind of get this ball rolling.
Oh, you go first.
Let me go first.
You want?
So I watched it yesterday, just so I knew what I was getting into, and then seeing it again today. I think there's a lot of themes in there. You know, they're trying to send a message of the numbers that served, wounded, and killed in action. It kind of transitions then into, you know, what the public's reaction was to the return of veterans. You know, some opposing views there. You know, the empty sleeve, you know, being a sign of valor, you know, from the Civil War, and then basically trying to cover up injuries post-World War I. So kind of a transition in the way that society was treating and looking at veterans. And then, you know, kind of transitioning into the experience of more modern veterans, with kind of a focus on not only the physical injuries and what we're able to do now that we were never able to do before. So we're seeing less deaths as a result of wounds received, but yet we're seeing a greater or a higher rate of disabled veterans, both physical and mental, and kind of turning the focus to that, saying, you know, post-traumatic stress is not something, yes, maybe that was only diagnosed and is now becoming able to be understood at the lowest level, but as he said, has existed since the beginning of time. So,
I mean, I never realized personally until I actually saw this what the percentages were for survivors of wounds in combat. I always went with the assumption that it was always going to be a greater survival rate over time, but I didn't know what it was going to be until I saw this. You don't really think about that kind of survival rate over time, but then you think about the evolution of war. Things change over time. There's the technologies in war, and to match it, the technologies in medical science has, in some sense, surpassed what the technology of war has. And in the back of my mind, I can tell you, when they made the statement that, you know, maybe it's possible them to bring it under 1%, I worry that something is going to come around and turn it the other way. That, you know, we're seeing a higher rate of survival. You know, like I said, back of the head, something may come around and change that.
yeah, or even, you know, the thought that, well, we've got it down to 1%, so it's less appalling. It's less
makes war sanitary.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's less danger of sending people to war.
Yeah.
You don't think about the consequences of it. Oh, we'll send however many hundreds of thousands. We'll only lose 2 or 3, and then something happens, and it's not 2 or 3. You're losing 2,000 or 3,000 because something new has come along.
Yeah. So, I mean, you look at the Civil War. You know, that was almost 30%.
Yeah.
You know, 3.5 million, 750,000 plus.
Imagine if imagine if it was the same rate for Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Think of how people would think of the war differently.
It was a minor percentage.
So my next kind of question, you talked about how kind of different interpretations of war, and then one of the themes I think they gradually built up is coming back into society. Working in the Vermont VA, can you kind of speak more to coming back to society, having veterans coming back, and kind of speaking to that whole process, and being a veteran, kind of speaking to that process as well?
Sure. I think the evolution in this country for society in general has been a more acceptance, you know, than, you know, you kind of, well, it's kind of like a sine wave. It's gone up and down, you know. Civil War versus World War I, World War II, very warmly received. You know, Korea, kind of the forgotten. Vietnam, you know, kind of a low rate of acceptance of veterans coming back. But then a huge, you know, upsurge, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. More of an acceptance, I don't think, an understanding, as they were making the point there, but at least an acceptance from society that you served because you felt an obligation or a desire, or for whatever reason that you decided to go. And I think at some level, and I'm still really not sure, that at least there's some appreciation in that recognition now. Vermont, I don't think is any better or worse than other places in the country. I think what we have going against us sometimes is the rural population that we have. So we don't have population centers where that percentage of the residents have military experience or have family members in the military. And we have no major bases here. The closest one is Fort Drum in New York. So I think that makes it hard too for people to understand what a military family goes through, what a military member goes through.
And for soldiers coming back, they have a hard time articulating what went on. They don't know how to tell their family what they saw. They don't know how to tell their friends who they spent the first 18 years of their lives around. They come back 4 years later. They have no idea what to say. There's no frame of reference. It's literally as if you came back to the United States and you came from a different culture. This wasn't where you came from. Different culture. You literally speak a different language. If I were to use the language that I would use while I served, most people would look at me and go, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. No different than someone who grew up in the inner cities of Boston with their accent and their jargon that they use. You have them talk to someone from Central Texas, they're going to sit there and go, I have no idea what you're talking about. I can't understand you. It's the same thing, but it's harder because we do speak the same language. We do use the same terms. It's just that it doesn't mean the same thing to us. And it's a lot of guys I served with have an extremely difficult time just dealing with people on an everyday basis. I know personally, I have a hard time in crowds. I can't go into a shopping mall. I can go in there, I go in, do my thing, I'm out in 5 minutes. I can't stay in any longer. It's different if a crowd is there for a purpose, but when everyone's just doing their own thing, going their own way, I have a hard time with it. And it took me probably 5 or 6 years to actually understand it myself. I couldn't understand why I didn't want to be there. And it took somebody else pointing it out to me that, hey, you used to not be like that. And light kind of turned on. And so that's one of the tough parts coming back, is that society, even though it hasn't really changed, for the veteran it has changed. Because you think differently, you see differently, you react differently.
Yeah, that was funny you mentioned about going to a shopping mall, because I spent a year in Afghanistan, and one of the things was, I was stationed in Maryland at the time, just outside of DC. So and there was, the Naval Academy is there, and Fort Myer is right downtown, and Fort Meade is there. But even there, running into people that I just spent a year in Afghanistan. Like, are we still in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
What? Huh?
It doesn't seem real.
Yeah.
It's almost like a dream. Like you're back, and
yeah.
Have you ever had the feeling like you wake up in the morning and you're not 100% sure you're awake and you feel sluggish, and it's almost like you are moving quickly but your brain isn't caught up to you? It's like that for the first time you come back. It's like, is this really real? Was it always this way?
Yeah.
How did I not see this before?
But having to go to a mall, which I had to,
oh boy,
within a couple of days of coming home, because I needed clothes. I mean, my stuff had been packed and all that, and that was it lasted about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And that was.
And unfortunately, what happens, and it's a term that we use, it's called self-medication. The guys come back, they don't know how to handle these things. They can't talk to anybody. They can't really go anywhere like they used to. So they turn to the bottle. It's self-medication. It's how you make the voices in your head go away. It's how you make the nightmares go away. It's how you get to sleep at night. I know some people who, they can't fall asleep unless they've had a couple of shots of whatever, tequila, whiskey, vodka. They can't do it. And it's a sad reality, but it is, as we would say, it is what it is.
Or they like to go back.
The gentleman at the end of the film was giving advice to people, saying, just listen. Don't say you're sorry, don't try to commiserate, don't say you understand. Listen. What advice do you guys have for people interacting with veterans coming home?
As far as advice goes, it doesn't come much better than what he said.
Just listen.
What that colonel said. Listen. Members of my family that I talk to, I know they're never going to understand. But I know I can tell the tale. I can talk to them. For the most part, they'll humor me. But it's nice that they're humoring me. Even if, I were to speak to any of you randomly. Just the fact that you sat down and you've taken the time to listen matters far more than trying to understand what I've seen, what I've gone through, what anyone has gone through. That's probably, I don't know if it's the simplest thing is the right term for it, but it's something that can be done very easily.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's not that maybe somebody's trying to convince you that their point of view in going was the right thing or that you should have gone, but just being willing to listen and try and understand.
To shift the conversation a little bit, what do you envision as public policy improvements, both the state level, the congressional level, might be made to ease the transition period or make life easier for veterans and their families?
Wow. I can say that there is no simple solution. There is no one thing that can be done. It is a massive number of things that have to be done that have small effects. I grew up in an area that we'll just simply say is not the kindest people towards military personnel. And getting people away from that kind of mindset can be helpful, but it may not be possible. Maybe some things like treating veterans better when they come back in general would be a good thing, but how can you legislate that? How can you force someone to do it? You really can't. There are things that we can say government can do. There's the VA, there's the medical facilities, there's programs they have to welcome us back, but I'll say from personal experience, they're nothing more than check the block. And if you don't know what that means, it means you go through a 40-hour class over a week and you checked off on a checklist, you can go on to the next thing. A lot of it turns out to be that. They don't take it seriously. It's, well, we have to do this, and when I came back, it was the same attitude. I have to get through this. So I guess you could say maybe taking more, I don't know if more seriously is the right term, but finding a better way to use what we already have in place.
Yeah, I think in my office, persistence is being there, being willing to listen, being willing to help, being willing to refer, to services that we don't provide, but there's other organizations out there, and just encouraging veterans, you know what, you're going to fall down, get back up. You're going to fall down, get back up. For the ones that really need a lot of help. But it's one of those, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Sometimes it's years before there's that realization, I need some help. Or then it transitions into, I want some help.
And sometimes there is never the recognition.
Yeah, there isn't, and that's unfortunate. But I think it's being persistent in having those services available to those who want it and then need it, and then are willing to form a partnership in getting help. And I'm just not talking about substance abuse help or psychological counseling. I'm talking about job training programs. I'm talking about any number of things that put a veteran back on track as much as possible to the way that life was before. You're never going to, you can't roll back time, you can't, duplicate maybe what was there before, but how can you get back to a place where you want to be?
I think my next question, so they mentioned a couple of times towards the end, something you've touched on, both of you, is that there's a gap in understanding between the veteran and the civilian who's never gone to war, and that it's an unbridgeable gap. What are the biggest problems that gap creates in terms of not just in terms of the veteran coming to society, in terms of veteran coming to society, without going into much of?
Well, the biggest issue I run into, it took me a while to figure out where it comes from, but perspective is the biggest difference. A veteran who has seen combat thinks about things differently. Their priorities are different. And if you have two people, whether they've been to combat or not, just two individuals who look at things differently, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be a divide between them. And I wish it weren't so, but unfortunately it's a reality of it. And there's a sense from myself sometimes, I'll admit to it, and a lot of the people I served with, is that the country that we served, we had the joke, but it really wasn't a joke, in the service of an ungrateful master. That we served people who didn't think about what was going on. They're just kind of like, oh, there's a war happening somewhere, but I'm going to go about my way to do it. And historically, we can say, over time, the country has created almost a subculture, which is the military. The military used to be part of everybody. It was, as they said, their sons and daughters going to it. Now the military is it's almost a taboo. It's almost, you don't talk about it. You don't interact with them. They're isolated. Our bases are, at least for the Army, with only one or two exceptions, the bases are isolated away from large population centers. You don't interact with a lot of people all the time. And when you isolate people, they begin to isolate themselves. And now the military is its own enemy. And when you don't understand, because the military doesn't understand how the civilian thinks, and the civilian has a hard time thinking about what the military thinks about, you've created two separate entities. And from what I know of history, it used to be, and I'm talking centuries in the past, there was no divide between civilian and military. There was no such thing really as military. It was everyone blended together, and those who ruled, and we're talking far back, were the ones who went and fought. There was no real military. It was just, when the threat came, guy in charge grabbed a couple people and took off to deal with it. Our society has changed that part of it. And in separating it, it has created maybe a better society in a different way, but this is the cost of it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I even said that right.
No, absolutely. No, you did. And I think to kind of follow up on that is for everybody to educate themselves. Thank you for coming tonight. I wish there was not such a big crowd across the street, but here. But that's
it is what it is.
That's it. That's life. But understanding it, and it just means educating yourself about foreign policy and what the implications of military involvement are, and then what the human costs are, and just being aware of that and understanding that every time you vote or don't vote, you're contributing to that process.
And
May I ask how many veterans there are in the room? None?
Yeah, no.
Me too.
Yeah.
there's one last piece to it is that they mentioned in the film is that there hasn't been a declared state of war since the Second World War. And during World War II and the previous wars, the country was at war. You know, even the everyday citizen felt the effect of war. There was war-level taxations, there was restrictions, there was blackouts, and you know they're constantly pushing to buy war bonds, and even the American industry was turned into a war machine. General Motors went from making cars, they get a call from the government saying you're going to make, it was B-24 or something that they made. Well, how many? Just make them. We'll worry about the cost when it's over. Just keep making them.
We'll tell you when to stop.
You know, everyone had to do their part. Even if you weren't carrying a rifle or flying in the cockpit of a plane, you had a piece to it. The whole country was at it. But after that point, there hasn't been the whole country going to it. And I could not imagine in today's society what would happen if Congress were to declare war suddenly on some enemy that we're facing. I couldn't imagine what would happen.
It's become institutionalized.
That's
You've got to have some enemy someplace so as to justify all that expense.
Mm-hmm.
And the human cost, well, that's just part of it.
Yeah.
It's the cost of doing business.
Yeah, so if they actually get rid of all that
Acceptable
stuff.
losses.
Sure. Sure. You know, Eisenhower warned about, you know, the military-industrial complex and, you know, where it was driving society. And
He didn't declare war on anybody.
No.
He said that he
You'd
was
seen.
sick of writing letters to home to people. You kids dead. Get over it. There's too many of those.
What happened in the roughly 5 years between the end of the World War II and the start of our involvement in Korea to change that? What happened on the American front, on the home front?
There were a lot of
It
changes.
decided that we had to fight godless communism. Harry Truman and Senator Vandenberg got together and decided to continue the fight against Joe Stalin and his thing, and Harry Truman says, well, I have to scare the bejesus out of the American public. And that's exactly what they did. Communists everywhere. And once they got the bomb, well, that was even more problem. And they just kept that up and from the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah. Well, you can look at a historical perspective, it was a response, you could say, to the failures leading up to the Second World War, is that when the likes of Hitler rose to power, the power in Europe, which was Britain, didn't stand up to them, didn't scare them. They appeased them, and it caused a massive snowball effect, the Second World War. So you could almost say what was done was the complete opposite. Instead of standing back and let's see what's happened, it's let's not let this happen again, let's jump on it before anything happens. And this was the consequence of that action this time. So that is one possible way to look at it. There's probably a dozen or better ways to look at that.
Yeah, I think from a societal standpoint, it was just sheer fatigue. I mean, it went from, 1938 to 1945, and now in 1948, you're going to restart the draft. People are like, what?
Yeah.
You had to prove that there was communists underneath everybody's bed.
Yeah.
So you're saying the need to scare the bejesus out of them was because they were concerned with war fatigue, and they didn't think people would be motivated. When you said
I'm not relating the two. I think from a societal standpoint, that's kind of one viewpoint. Ken gave a second one. A third one would be, society as a whole. I think was just rationing had taken its toll, and victory gardens, and people wanted their life to get back to normal. World War II vets wanted, to buy their own houses. They wanted a job. They wanted the American dream. They had just, risked their lives, and they wanted the American dream to get on with it. You know, so I mean, I
Well, when Eisenhower became president, he stopped the Korean War. He said, we're not going to have this anymore. And he didn't have a lot of little dust-ups on during the 50s, but he kept out of any big wars. There wasn't going to be any threat of any of that. And people complain, oh, you got to have a big war. He said, And he, of course, he had the authority and the reputation behind him, so he couldn't say that he was anti-war because he invaded Europe, and he knew everybody involved personally, so it was different. It's a different world.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, it lends a different perspective. I mean, think about it. To get into Korea, who was the president?
Truman.
Truman, you know, he was president during the last part of the Second World War. He didn't serve in it. Eisenhower served in it, and that again can speak to the difference in how people see things and perceive things between civilian and military.
But Truman was a colonel in World War I.
Yes.
World War I, yeah.
But
that was a different war, though.
very, very different.
Right.
And so you could say Eisenhower was more up to date, more current on, you could say not necessarily the attitudes, but the mentality that war would have.
Right.
And so that lends that perspective, but you know.
Any more questions? I want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for your wonderful perspective on this film, on these deep issues. Any other questions from the audience? No. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay. We appreciate the opportunity.